So welcome everybody to this Carla presentation. My name is Kate Paisani and I work at Carla. So I am really happy to be introducing our speaker today, Federico Fabbri. Federico just joined our applied linguistics community here at the University of Minnesota in August. He came to us from the University of Arizona, and he is the new director of language instruction in Italian in the Department of French and Italian. So I get to work with him on a regular basis because I'm also in that department. And today he's going to be presenting some of the findings from his dissertation research. And the title of his talk is Studying Romance Languages in the US, Decision-Making in Regard to Language Choice and Persistence After the Language Requirement. Just so you know, the chat is open. I'll be monitoring it during the talk. Please use the chat to ask questions, and I will field those on your behalf for Federico when the talk is over. Welcome, Federico. I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, and welcome to the presentation of my doctoral research project, a project that I've been having the pleasure to work for since the very beginning of my PhD path 4 years ago. And so I would like, before starting, to say thanks, first of all, to Kate and all of Carla for inviting me to be one of the presenters this year. And in addition to that, for giving me a warm welcome to the University of Minnesota, as I am just starting my first year here at the U. I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank my wonderful committee members who guided me and supported me throughout this journey. Beatrice Dupuy, Suzanne Pamphor-Avriz, and Dwight Atkinson, all from the University of Arizona. So welcome to the presentation of this project that is called Studying Romance Languages in the US. And let's start with the premises of my research. The premises of the studies of this study are that there's been an ongoing enrollment crisis in US-based programs in second language and in foreign language education. Now, up until the end of the 2000s, there has been a period of growth for these programs, and data from MLA reports, MLA being the Modern Language Association, reported an increase up until 2009. But then in the subsequent two reports, there has been a steady and increasing decline in overall enrollment numbers. And so between 2013 and 2016, the last full report that is available, there has been a drop of 9.2% in total enrollments, with the only exceptions being Japanese and Korean, which recorded instead a small growth. There is now, we are all waiting for a new full report from the MLA. There has been a snapshot report, meaning that not all institutions that participated in the previous report as yet participated, but the trend and the data we have right now are particularly worrisome because it looks like we have all the reasons to worry about. And although this data, like I said, isn't complete, it's partial, but it's so far showing an overall decrease of 15.4%. Now, the low enrollment is not the only issue that the MLA report identified. The other being, the other being low retention, meaning that most students quit after completing the language requirement. This is an inference that I make based on the fact that the MLA distinguishes introductory as first 2 years of instruction and advanced as third year and beyond. And we'll see that these numbers are vastly different from the introductory and the advanced levels. Let's look specifically at the situation of Romance languages for both enrollments and retention. Now, we've had, for all four languages, a considerable decline in total enrollments. This is particularly relevant, or particularly large for Italian and Portuguese. And Italian, with a minus 20.1%, is recorded the largest drop among the 10 most studied languages in the US. But the trend is negative for all four. As far as retention, you see that there is a very considerable difference numbers in terms of introductory level enrollments, again, first 2 years or 4 semesters, or advanced, with a ratio of 5:1 or even 10:1 for Italian, meaning that for every 10 students enrolled in the first 2 years of language courses, only one on average will continue on to the third. Now, in addition to this premise of declining trend in enrollments, there have been a number of issues identified by relevant studies in our field. I've divided them in 3 categories. The first category being curriculum, a bifurcation, meaning difference in content and skills and preparation required between these introductory and advanced levels, sometimes implying that students may not be prepared to make the jump to the third-year courses, and or that they might not be as interested in the content of such courses. Another point to bring up is the fact that oftentimes we use expensive teaching materials, for example, textbooks that oftentimes, however, are inadequate, for example, in terms of offerings of cultural content or certain outdated views on language learning that are nonetheless perpetuated by these materials. Another category has to do with the personnel. And for example, the same bifurcation happening with very different people in terms of background, in terms of contract, that teach at the advanced and introductory level, implying that there is little communication, insufficient communication sometimes between different faculty members, as well as their own personal goals and backgrounds. And oftentimes this is combined with a lack of language professionals, applied linguists or the like, in key positions, for example, that of director of language instruction or director of basic language program. The third category of issues I wanted to talk about is a little broader and societal, something that is a little harder for language programs to fight against. One is a generalized perceived low value of foreign language education in the US. It's a narrative for which the US, being a primarily English-speaking country, having proficiency in a second language is a bonus, but not something that is as important as gaining a solid foundation in other disciplines, for example, STEM. But also at the program level, sometimes there's a lack of a shared vision within programs and across programs in terms of what are we trying to accomplish as language programs, what are we trying to achieve, what type of individuals and professionals we're trying to form. You'll see that although a number of issues have been identified, something that is somewhat underrepresented in these studies on enrollment and retention is the student perspective. And this is one of the very purposes that my study wanted to basically address. And there are, however, other strands of applied linguistic research that did focus on the student perspective, one of which being motivation. There have been decades of research on language motivation, and one of the most successful models has been the second language motivational self-system by Zoltan Dornier, which has had numerous iterations. And this has been particularly successful I think, for its comprehensiveness and adaptability to not only account to present motivators, but also accounting for the future image of the self. And to very brief review how this model is structured, there's three dimensions. One called the ideal second language self, which is composed of, to cite older models, integrative or intrinsic motivation, as well as a learner's projection of seeing a future self who is proficient, able, and successful learning the foreign language. The L2 second language self is instead all of those dimensions that concern external pressures and a learner's desire to avoid negative outcomes and to meet others' expectations, whether those are family or advisors or the job market, also for or anything that you perceive to be externally motivated and often overlapping with more instrumental or extrinsic motivation. Last but not least, the language learning experience, which is the impact of the elements that make up the language learning environment, the curriculum, the materials, the teachers, the classmates, the grades, and so forth. Now, there have been a number of studies on language motivation that adopted this or other models for motivation. However, many of these present limitations. The first one is a limitation that is really inherent to a lot of these studies, and that is the fact that data was collected at a certain place in a certain time, and what was the case for those studies may not necessarily be replicable or being still the case with today's students in other languages or contexts. Many of the studies that I reviewed were at data collected before the enrollment crisis began. Others collected outside of the US, so not so relevant to the US educational system. Some of these studies have a very broad or a very narrow focus. Some are focused on 10 or more languages, or a single one, but there's very few that focus on Romance languages and none that compare the 4 Romance languages that are targeted in the study: French, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish, or the 4 more taught languages in the US, taught Romance languages in the US. Some other these studies have an unclear distinction between the initial motivation to enroll in a language and a motivation to persist or quit or quit language study after already beginning. So that's something that I also wanted to discuss somewhat separately. Last but not least, though there has been a shift in adopted methodologies toward more qualitative-based research. Historically, most of these studies, especially those that have been centered on the L2 MSS, have been quantitative-based and not so much on the qualitative side. So let us wrap up the premises of my study very quickly. An ongoing enrollment crisis. So fewer students take language courses to begin with. Fewer students continue after the language requirement. There are a number of issues identified in the literature as well concerning language programs. Last but not least, there's a limited understanding of the student's perspective. And with all these premises, the research questions from a study are the following. The first one is, what factor do US undergraduate students mention for enrolling in these introductory level courses in Romance languages? French, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish specifically. Which, if any, are cross-language, and which, if any, are language-specific? Same question, but applied to the decision of continuing Romance language study after the completion of the language requirement. Again, which factors are cited across language, which ones are cited at a language-specific level, if any, and so forth. So in order to investigate these two questions, I contacted 189 Romance language programs housed within 53 US-based universities, of which 50 programs within 27 different universities participated. And I have to be thankful also, among others, to the University of Minnesota for being one of the universities that contributed the most participants. The criteria for inclusion for being contacted were that each of the universities needed to offer at least one, if not more, of these Romance languages, and that at least one of these Romance language programs would be in the top 20 based on total enrollment or total size as of 2016 data coming from the Modern Language Association report that I mentioned prior. Now, what about the participants? The only criterion is that they would be US-based undergraduate students studying only one Romance language at the university level at the time of data collection. I purposely collected and yet not included in the study data coming from students that are studying multiple foreign languages, because past studies have shown that their motivational profile may be considerably different from those that are only studying one language. Now, to my questionnaire, I received 684 total responses. 417 were complete and usable. Just a couple of quick facts about the participants. The overwhelming majority was between 18 and 24 years old. A majority identified themselves as women and as white. Again, a vast majority indicated that they are first or native speakers of English. And again, a vast majority of them had some level of experience studying Romance languages prior to their enrollment at the college level. Among these questionnaire respondents, I interviewed 16 people, 4 per target language. And within these 4, I sought to have 2 that declared that they intended to continue past the requirement, and 2 that stated that they intended to quit. And also to have each interviewee coming from a different university. I'm going to actually take these out because they are bugging me a little bit.
Hear me? Can you still hear me all right? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, cool. So as for the design of my research, okay. It was made of 2 parts. First was a questionnaire that I designed on Qualtrics that took about 15 to 20 minutes for students to take. It had 6 parts, starting with an introductory reading and a consent form, and moving on to demographics and the questions concerning participants' past learning experiences. A third part targeting specifically university level language learning experiences. This part included 5 open-ended questions that targeted students' opinions on why is there a language requirement to begin with, why did they choose to learn a specific language, and whether they intended at the time of data collection to continue or not with language study upon fulfilling the language requirement. A very bulky part was the Likert type items. These were 95 language-specific statements. They were the same statements across languages, but they were basically displayed based on the language that each participant was studied. And this was an adaptation of a well-known questionnaire by Taguchi and colleagues, 2009. There was a fifth part on goals and expectation for language study, which was taken from another important study on goals misalignment between students and faculty members from Magnan and colleagues. The findings were not included in the present study, but I am thinking of using them in the future. And then a conclusion. As for the interview protocol, the interviews all took place on Zoom with 30 to 60 minutes completion time per each participant. They were individual and semi-structured, so there was a starting protocol, but I let participants speak freely if they had something that they wanted to add or expand on any given question. And again, there was different sections. I started with a question about upbringing, whether they had early exposure to foreign languages, whether they were heritage speakers or they had friends or family living abroad, living in a language where in a country where the target language was spoken or otherwise. I asked them about their past language learning experiences that are often during high school. And so I asked them which language or languages they studied, for how long, what was their relationship like with their classmates and with their teachers. Then, of course, apart talking about the university level language learning experiences, I asked them again to expand on their questionnaire responses. I asked them to talk about how do they perceive their current experience in the language program, whether they intended to continue or not, whether they thought of language study as a priority for themselves or not. And a last part on their goals for language learning. Goals intended both as goals to be achieved within their time as college students, but also after the end of their experiences as college students, whether they wanted to envision, they could envision using that target language in different areas of their life, whether personal, professional, or both. As far as that analysis went, for the Likert type items, I have employed descriptive statistics and I've divided those findings by language studied. I also categorize these items under the 3 dimensions of the Dornier's motivational model, the L2 motivational self-system that we talked about. As far as the open-ended written question and individual interviews, I use the do's and reflexive thematic analysis to identify a list of codes, specifically a list of positive and negative motivational factors, which were also categorized under the 3 dimensions of Dornier's model. And so to take a quick look at these positive factors under the ideal L2 self, I would like to stress out for just a second that I have interpreted these 3 dimensions more broadly than they were originally intended, but having those 3 dimensions help me categorize better where these factors could possibly belong. And so we have under this dimension factors including the desire of learners to improve their own language skills in a more linguistic sense, but also an interest in second language culture, considerations in regard to the desire to live abroad, or even to just study or travel abroad for a shorter period of time, and so forth. For the L2 self, a lot of the external pressure coming from the desire to be competitive in the job market, or a desire to fulfill not only language requirement itself, but also potentially language major or language minor in the future. And as far as the language learning experience, some themes that emerge were consideration on students particularly enjoying their courses, or in some cases, picking a language or studying a language because another one was not available or didn't fit in their schedule, or considerations for related to connected to past language learning experiences and so forth. Very similar to these were the negative factors, and several of which were basically the negation of the positive ones we were talking about before. So students that express a lack of interest for study abroad or for study in general, or couldn't see a use for their language study, or they wanted to study something else, or simply they were happy with the progress that they had made and deciding not to continue. Several of the consideration made in regard to the L2 language self were the perception of cost of education, time constraints, or the inability to fit those language courses within a schedule that included other disciplines, or simply they had met the requirement and they did not intend to continue further than that. In regard to the language learning experience, instead, some consideration included the perception of a language being studied being difficult, or the learner feeling not very good at language learning, or simply disliking the course, the exams, the professors, and so forth, or the desire for others to pursue those language learning opportunities outside of an academic environment, for example, using an app like Duolingo or Babbel or others that were mentioned by the participants. So let us summarize, first of all, some of the findings for the first research question, which once again was about reasons or salient reasons why participants chose to study French, Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish. So something we can see in regard to the identified themes on the question, what is the most important reason why you are currently studying this language? There are, you can see different dimensions that were most salient, and there was a lot of diversity on which ones were most salient, and you can see that there were none that was, for either language, outstandingly more prominent than others. Having said that, there are a few patterns that could be identified in the data. So 2 of these dimensions were salient across all target languages. One was the choosing any language for a desire to improve language skills. A lot of these considerations were somewhat vague, if I may say, as in I want to become proficient, or I want to be able to be fluent. Things that to me implied both a vagueness in learners' understanding, self-understanding of why they were studying those languages, and oftentimes mimic the language found in documents like syllabi or study abroad brochures, indicating that some learners may have been regurgitating more than having a clear idea of why, what they wanted to accomplish as language learners. The other one that was salient across target languages, and especially salient for French learning participants, was the requirement itself, as in, I am here because I have to. I probably wouldn't be if I didn't have to be here. Beyond that, there were some salient dimensions that were language specific. Career and instrumentality was salient for Spanish. This was not surprising. It's consistent with findings in a related study that I've identified Spanish as perceived as the most useful, if not the only useful language for the US job market. Travel and study abroad was particularly salient for learners of French and Italian. Heritage for Italian and Portuguese, and speaking, for example, with local community in Spanish. And again, these I think are consistent with some other findings in other study. And for example, for Italian and Portuguese, indicated something that I'll be talking about briefly, that some students that chose those languages did so for a specifically very deliberate purpose to reconnect with their roots, or for reasons more specific than oftentimes were the case for learners of French and Spanish, also because these languages were more commonly available in high school settings, unlike Italian and Portuguese. Now, part of this question was also targeting the rates of agreement to different statements. Let's start with the ideal language self. Again, this is the dimension addressing more intrinsic, integrative, and connected to what students ideally would like to get out of that language learning experience. And you can see that, and we'll look at some of these statements more closely, that there are generally high, for the top statements, levels of aggregate agreements for for all four languages, and slightly lower levels of high disagreement to some of these statements, with statements in the top 5 going as low as 44%. Let's see what were the statements that were most agreed with and disagreed with by participants in the study. Now, the most agreed with statements concerned a desire for a lot of learners to go on vacation, a short-term trip, or comments about the language that they're studying being beautiful, or the general desire or curiosity for knowing more about the target language speaking countries or the people that live in those countries. However, the most disagreed with statements indicated that although these students were curious about meeting people from these countries, they rarely had pre-existing networks or communities of speakers or people living in a country where the language was spoken. And although many of them indicated that they would like to go on vacation, very few could imagine themselves living or studying, at least, in a university where all the courses were taught in the second language, indicating a somewhat of a desire to immerse themselves in the language, but not to an extent of moving one's life abroad altogether. Moving on to the second set of statements, we see kind of the opposite situation. We see in the aggregate agreement rates that are considerably low if we consider the top 5 statements per language, and that there's a little more diversity in terms of which statements were rated the highest by learners of different languages. The opposite was true of disagreements. There were very few statements that had the same levels of disagreements across languages, and with much higher rates of disagreement. Let's see, for example, which statement these are. The most agreed with statements in this section included consideration about success in the course. I have to study the language because I do not want to fail the course, or because I would feel ashamed if I got bad grades in it, or it's important because it's necessary to make me stand out in the job market, and in some cases because I want to take advanced courses in that second language. The most disagreed with statements, those that had a very, very high rate of aggregate disagreement, where my family puts a lot of pressure on me to study the language. I was influenced because of on-campus recruitment events, and studying language is important because I want to major in it, implying that a very large number of participants rejected the idea of external pressures, whether these were coming from their family or by campus-related initiatives to recruit in languages, but also that very few students were inclined to considering a major in a second language, while several of those instead expressed a general interest in taking advanced level courses in that language, if that makes sense. Last but not least, we have the language learning experience. These are statements that describe elements of the language learning environment. Again, classmates, grades, teachers, atmosphere, and so forth. And again, we see that we have high levels of agreements for the top statements and slightly lower level of disagreements overall. Most agreed with statements were appreciation, oftentimes, of the language instructor, or the learning of the second language, the atmosphere, and so forth. The most disagreed with were instead in regard to, well, this is probably a comforting news for us, that few, I should say, many disagreed with a statement describing their choice of language motivated with a bad experience studying a different language in the past. But also, unfortunately, that there few students felt that they were able to connect with other students of that language by participating in extracurricular activities, whether this was because they were non-offered or simply because they didn't have time to attend them. So to summarize the salient findings for this first research question, we have the requirement was particularly prominent for the choice of French. To me, this indicated a choice of French by some of the participants as a default. Many that have taken it in high school just simply continued with that, and sometimes they didn't have more than the requirement itself as a reason why they chose specifically to study French. In Spanish, we had a similar situation, but it was more prominent than it was in French. Those considerations in regard to career applications and more instrumental reasons behind that choice of Spanish. More personal and more deliberately family-related reasons for the choice of Italian and Portuguese, but that overall there were general similarities, especially for Likert type items, and particularly there were high agreement rates with many of the statements labeled under the ideal L2 and L2 learning experience, and higher disagreement and lower agreement rates with several of the auto L2 self statements instead. Moving on to the second research question, which is instead targeting specifically reasons, salient reasons why students chose to continue or stated their intention to continue or quit language study upon the fulfillment of their language requirement. And we can see that for all 4 languages, first of all, a large majority stated that they intended to continue rather than not, which is something that is important to keep in mind because this is in more than partial contradiction with the data coming from national reports, something that we'll address a little bit later. But you can see that both at a language-specific level and overall, over 60% of students considering all 4 target languages stated that they intended to continue language study past the requirement. Something that was interesting to consider very briefly was also at which level they were and whether that had an impact on their reported intention to continue or not. And you can see there are different patterns. And for students of French, it seemed that like as they progressed through the language sequence, they seemed to become more and more inclined to continue. Whereas in Italian, they were most inclined to continue in their first year, but then in the second year, their desire to continue fell. Harder patterns to discern for Spanish and for Portuguese instead. Also, probably because there were fewer participants in those 2 languages, which is, again, something we'll briefly talk about in the limitation section. Now, let us look at the reasons that were cited most often by students who stated their intention to continue. And you can see that there's a overwhelmingly more prevalent dimension over the others. And that is, again, something we found in regard to the first research question, desire to improve language skills. These were language-related considerations that not only, as we talked about before, may indicate a certain vagueness or an ability to phrase specific language learning goals, but also perhaps the perception of not yet having reached a proficiency level that students themselves are satisfied with, hence the desire to continue studying. Other themes that were relevant were a general interest in language study, travel study abroad, and pursuit of a language major or minor, although I need to point out that these have a much lower saliency than the desire to improve language skills had. Let us look at what happened with the students that instead stated their desire not to continue. And we can see, again, an overwhelmingly prevalent dimension, which is time constraints. And this, to me, inferring by this data, but also by talking with interviewees, that a very large portion of students, while enjoyed language learning, they considered it as a secondary priority, something that they would make time for gladly, but if and only if they didn't have conflict with other discipline, with other subjects that they deemed a priority, higher priority in language learning. And this is actually further validated by the fact that although a very large number of students declare that they intended to continue past the requirement, very few actually were pursuing a language major or minor at the time of data collection, and very few stated their desire of pursuing one. And this in spite of generally positive opinions on language learning environments, which means that on average, students really like us and our work as educators, but these alone are not good enough reasons for them to consider continuing or to take language pursuit seriously enough as to consider it a priority for their academic path. This, to me, might also indicate some kind of ideology bias that was possibly formed toward language study prior, possibly in high school. A lot of considerations were made in regard to the prevalence of traditional approaches, or language being about memorization and accuracy and grammar. And I think that that might have been perceived as one of the reasons why a number of students stated that they felt there was little real world, real life applicability of their language study. Other themes that were present, although with low saliency, was a desire to engage with language learning recreationally, again, using apps, for example, or watching movies or reading books outside of class. Perception of difficulty or lack of interest in language study. So to summarize this section, most participants intended to continue after the language requirement, although they showed, however, different level-based trends depending on the language study. There was a low presence of students pursuing a language major and minor, even though most intended to continue. And that across languages, there were general similarities for themes. And again, the desire to improve language skills was most prevalent across students that intended to continue. And the time constraints was by far the most prevalent among students that stated an intention to quit. So the last section of the presentation are basically the answer to the questions, what now, or so what? And I think I could identify a number of pedagogical implications crossing this data with findings from relevant studies in applied linguistics in enrollment and retention. One is that it is absolutely necessary that we continue protecting the language requirement, because we've seen that many students would not even consider learning a language if they didn't have to. Now, of course, in one hand, they are our captive audience, but data coming from universities that have removed that requirement show that their enrollment declined sharply. Therefore, it is very, very important that we strive to protect the language requirement in our respective institutions. One innovation to consider to adopt a flexible approach to course sequencing. One idea could be to include some of the introductory language courses into language major and minor requirements. This would possibly imply that there will be a greater level of attention coming from programs to make sure that these courses function well. And it would also give potentially the opportunity to students not only to take those courses more seriously, but also to start applying those courses toward earning a major or a minor in a language, and having had a head start with courses that also overlap with the language requirement. Another idea would be to desequence part of the language curriculum. I know that a lot of these courses that we offer are to be taken in a sequence, and that's not always possible to change, but in some cases it might be possible, and that might help students who have specific time constraints, schedule constraints, to possibly take languages that fit their schedule and continue their language study, at least to an extent that they can. Another idea, not to replace in-person courses, which I think have a lot of affordances, but to complement them, is to offer blended learning language course offerings, for example, accelerated online synchronous courses. But also something that I think became very clear from this study on my end is that there might be not enough that we know about who our students are, what they've studied, what resources, but also what ideologies do they bring, even on the first semester, at the first semester level, as they walk into our classroom. Who are they? What do they think that language learning is about? Who are their goals? Have they even thought about what their goals might be? And I think that it's a very worthwhile effort of programs would be to assess those on a regular basis. One way would be to administer an initial survey to understand better who the student population that we work with is like and what ideas they have, but also to repeat this process of assessment throughout the course sequence. But also to incorporate reflective activities in language curricula. These students are young, they are still learning who they are, and incorporating those reflective activities a little more meta might help them understand why they're there in our classes, what they want to get out of those classes, what might be some goals that apply to their own personal as well as professional life. And to as much as possible, let's involve them. Let's ask them what they want, what they like, what they dislike, what do they expect? Do we meet those expectations or not? And of course, although it might not always be possible to meet those expectations, that we make an effort to listen to what they have to say, and now we can best serve their goals and their desires, which, as studies identified, may not always align with what we as educators or language programs might be able or willing to offer. Something that came up is that we need to emphasize as language programs any connections that are possible between what happens in the classroom, often a bubble, and the real world. So it is not just about providing opportunities for professional applications, but even any applications, any way to break that bubble and make connections between what we do in class and the world outside. So a backward design approach, starting with identifying goals and might come in handy, as well as integrating language and culture that have been historically separated in a way that is artificial, but in ways, for example, adopting literacies and genre-based pedagogies, we can bridge that gap. That is both bridging a gap between the real world and the classroom, but also between introductory and advanced level courses. So it may have multiple benefits. We should consider, in this sense, to incorporate real world materials, not readings or otherwise that were built or made for educational purposes, specifically like those often find in textbooks, but instead coming from the internet or the real world, the real genres that are consumed by target language speakers as well. To this extent, of course, these materials may benefit from an engagement in collaborative material selections across different programs and across different instructors, but also, of course, the adoption or the development of OER projects that oftentimes have been addressing or attempting to address these well-known issues in the quality of materials we employ in our classrooms. Also to provide sustainable opportunities for contact with language speakers. One is not only study abroad, which not only should we strive to make it affordable and sustainable, but sometimes for some students may not be possible or desirable to make to travel or study abroad, and therefore we should consider offering them opportunities that are not just bound to a physical travel abroad, but it can also be achieved by means of connecting digitally, for example, through telecollaboration with other speakers of the target language that live elsewhere in the world. To diversify our course content, to offer both advanced level courses that might be fitting with the students' interest, but also to offer dual degrees, as some programs have been doing already across the US with successful results. Last but not least, to invest in teacher training, and not only to promote that materials development that we're talking about, but also to offer graduate credit, for example, as there's sometimes this tension between in programs that have graduate students between the time allotted to lesson planning and to teaching activities and that allotted to doing well in coursework, writing, publishing, attending conferences, and so forth. And one way to bridge that gap, again, is also to adopt faculty graduate student mentorship models, and I'm happy to expand on this with any of you who might be interested more in hearing about this. Very, very important, community building, taking advantage of the fact that we are teaching small classes and we meet multiple times a week, something that most other disciplines don't have. And this could mean not only to promote interactive in-class activities, which I'm sure many of us already do, but also to promote at-home collaborative assignment and projects that will stimulate those students to meet outside of class time together in small groups, but also offer program-wide opportunities. In addition to the curricular events that are oftentimes offered by many programs, also to consider initiatives such as peer mentoring that might favor that meeting people within the same program, even across different course levels. Last but not least, to create partnership and ties with off-campus organizations. This could be cultural centers or organizers of movie festivals, or any institution that creates some sort of connection that can help us establish that connection between what we study in class and the real world. Last but not least, I would like to talk about some limitation of the study. One is, of course, that the data I based my study on was from 2016, and I feel like I should acknowledge, although it looks like, unfortunately, the trend is still negative, and so the data I found is still relevant to today's situation. Another possible limitation is the representativeness, and then although many programs kindly participated, several others did not, and so having had more programs would have contributing to to a greater representativeness of my data. But also there was although there was a large sample overall, it was still relatively small considering the total pool of language learners that were available within those institutions. Another something interesting to consider, that although we had a good amount of participants in French and Italian, fewer in Portuguese and Spanish, and also that given that many students, the majority of students, stated their intention to continue post-requirement, and we have seen that this is in contradiction with nationwide data, that there may have been some level of response bias, as in a prevalence of highly motivated language learners that took the questionnaire or did the interview with me. Some themes deserve greater attention that there was given to them in the study. For example, the language learning student beliefs is something that emerged that's very important, and I think could be expanded further in the future, but also more of a possible focus on future travel abroad and interactions with language speakers. And of course, one inherent limitation is the fact that this study was collected at a certain time in history and in certain places, and therefore it will not stay relevant. It will need to be repeated in the future. But closing with a possible affordance, it was built with the idea that a similar study design could be applicable to different contexts, different languages, and I'm hoping that this will be the case in the future. That ends my presentation, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who was here today, and to give the word to Kate for the Q&A portion, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for listening to this.
Thank you, Federico. Of course, my brain is spinning now. I have so many ideas and questions and thoughts. So we have one question in the chat from Sarah, and she'd like to know more about the idea of including introductory courses as part of the major or minor, and also just a quick explanation of what a dual degree might look like. I know you have a little bit of experience with the latter. I don't know if you have any experience with the former.
Yes and no. So historically, in most language programs, the first 4 semester, the first 2 years of language courses did not count toward language minors or language majors. And the idea of potentially including some of those, even if it's the 4th semester of the 3rd and 4th semester, would help both students getting closer to be able to complete a major or minor, maybe making them more inclined to consider that as a possibility. But also, I think it would give a different level of respect for those classes that are not just part of a requirement, but they actually are classes that contribute to an academic pursuit that could be recognized with a major or a minor. And something that is actually has been done at my previous university, the University of Arizona. First, I think the Italian program was the first one, but then other language program followed suits. And now second-year courses, so 3rd and 4th semester classes, are considered part of major and minors. And so as part of recruitment efforts, we were able to tell students that not only they were satisfying the language requirement, but also they were already working toward completing a minor or a major. And if they could complete 3 or 4 more classes, they would complete a minor. And then oftentimes it was a matter of adding 3 or more classes on top of those to reach a full language major, which was something that was appealing to a lot of students, though very few exclusively consider language as a primary academic pursuit. Several were inclined to at least consider the possibility of pairing language or language study with something else. As far as dual degrees go, I have had some experience in the Department of Public and Applied Humanities, which has been booming at my previous institution, not a language program per se, but has offered a number of degrees that combine a certain level of core courses in introducing students to humanities-related principles of looking at the world, together with a number of courses in different disciplines. And this program has been absolutely booming, reaching over 200 majors in just the 6 years after it was born. I have read some articles that were included in my literature review on some programs that have, for example, combined language study and engineering. And I think there are initiatives ongoing in other schools. So that's definitely an avenue that I think would be challenging and yet very interesting to consider for language programs, that they would start building interdisciplinary connection, not only in the courses that they're offering, but also by reaching out to different units and different disciplines and establishing ways in which students could earn dual degrees. I hope that answers the question well enough.
So Mandy has also added a question in the chat, but I actually have a question about careers that I think might be a nice segue from the response that you just gave about dual degree programs. So I was really interested in the data around how students perceive the connection between language study and careers. And it's no surprise that students studying Spanish think that that's a much more useful language for careers than other Romance languages. But I'm just wondering about your thoughts. I'm thinking more about implications of this finding than anything else. I mean, we were at, many of us in this call were at a meeting earlier this week where we talked about careers in connection with language study, and that one study shows that 90% of businesses value language, some degree of language proficiency in their employees, and prefer that their employees have some degree of language proficiency. So I'm just wondering about the implications for this in terms of the discourse around language study and the messaging that university administrators are giving related to language study and careers, and the messages that language departments are giving related to language study and careers. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. And I'm hoping it addresses your question well enough, but it's something that definitely came up in the data. And how I compared it with my experience looking at how departments have I've been reaching out universities to recruit students on the basis of career opportunities. And I find that by talking to students themselves, they were, of course, interested in the applicability of a language to a career. But what emerged was that their desire was, first and foremost, to connect with the real world, to apply what they learn outside of class. And this included, of course, those career opportunities, but it was not limited to that. Students wanted to see that they could be able to make a difference in the local community. It didn't have to mean a 6- or 7-figure job. Of course, that would be desirable if it did. But I think in that regards, academic programs and university have been right to try to market some instrumental reasons to students. But I think that that's just part of what the students really desire out of their educational experience. And I don't think that ultimately, especially given the high disagreement rates onto those more instrumental statements, I don't think that for students it's a primary reason to pursue a language, with maybe the exception of Spanish. And therefore that centering recruitment efforts on instrumental reasons alone might not yield as positive and as successful result as we would hope it could do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, or students don't realize that other languages have instrumental value, right? I mean, that's kind of what I'm suggesting. I'm not trying to completely instrumentalize language study. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I wonder if this is a way to draw more students in. Anyway, we can talk about this more at another time. I want to get to Mandy's question because I think it's one that's been upvoted. So I think we want to go ahead and ask it. So Mandy asked, did students' beliefs about language learning come out at all in the data? I've been hearing about how many students think they can't learn a language or that it's hard. So I'm curious whether anything was revealed in your study about this.
Yes. So, like I said, I cited that as both one of the most interesting findings and also one of the limitations, because I think it's something that I had realized was more important than I initially had factored in when I was designing the study. But to me, even just, and this is something especially came up in the interviews as well as in the open-ended written questions, that students had a lot of ideas of what learning a language was about. They may have been even first semester students in their course, but they thought that language was, I had students talking about, oh, I'm not good because I don't have really good memory. And implying that they assumed that learning a language successfully implied having to memorize a lot of vocab words or verbs or conjugation or things like that. Or some made comments about having a bad accent. And so I feel like a lot of the ideologies, which I have inferred may have come from their previous pre-college language experiences, came from high school or middle school experiences in which they were exposed to probably traditional accuracy-based, four skill-based approaches to language learning, which is what shaped their ideas. And so this is why, although some things kind of spontaneously emerged in the data, it's something that I think if I were to do the study again, I would pay more deliberate attention to, because I think there's a lot to tap in that. And we make all sorts of assumptions when we meet students, and we on who they are, or what experiences they may have had, or what ideas they may have in regard to language learning. But there's actually a wealth of very diverse perspectives, experiences, resources, and ideas. And this is why, to me, is very, very important. It's something that I've been working on as a DLI of the Italian program here, to better understand who our students are, and to start doing that as soon as they walk our door at the very beginning of the semester, if that answers the question.
Yeah. So one last quick question. I think
Yes.
this will be a quick one. This is also from Mandy, and she asked if you know of any programs that have unsequenced courses. She's thinking of ways to let students continue studying their language beyond the requirement, and maybe this could be a good strategy.
Absolutely. So I would have to review the specific study, and I'm happy to send those resources over to Mandy. Of course, certain language courses were largely sequenced. However, they might have been, I don't remember which programs exactly, but I know that this has been done in the US by some programs, that a number of courses that were previously only accessible by students that had completed a certain course at the second year or even at the third year became offered not only at different times, but also open up to students of more diverse levels. And I know that some programs have tried to address that by offering more courses, my content-based courses in English. But my point, and the point of these studies, is that to some extent, this could be done and at target language courses too. I don't remember off the top of my head, because I read a lot of different articles to create this project, but I'd be happy to fetch those articles and send them your way.
Perfect. And you know how to reach Mandy, so
I do.
It'll be easy to share that information with her. So we're at the top of the hour. So I want to thank Federico for this really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Mandy just put in the chat, my mind is spinning. And I think maybe many of us in this room who are interested in issues of curriculum and recruitment and retention are feeling the same way. So thank you so much, Federico. So thank you all, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.